What if the gods who taught humanity everything didn't simply fade into legend? What if they left? Not gradually, not through the slow erosion of belief, but deliberately, urgently, as though time itself was running out. In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, atop ziggurats that rise from the sand like frozen staircases to nowhere, archaeologists have found something strange. Empty chambers, beds prepared for divine visitors, offerings laid out and never consumed. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, but every arrival implies a departure, and the tablets that document their coming also document something else, their leaving. Before we follow them into the silence they left behind, consider subscribing if you're drawn to histories that refuse to end where they should. And if you're listening in the dark, tell me where you are. At the summit of the Ziggurat of Ur, where the final staircase ends and the platform opens to nothing but sky, the wind has not stopped moving in 5,000 years. It comes from the south, from the marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates once braided together before emptying into the Persian Gulf, and it carries with it the taste of salt and dust and distances that have no names. In the hours before dawn, when the desert cold still clings to the mud brick and the stars fade slowly into grey, the ruins take on a quality that photographs cannot capture, a weight of substance that presses against the ears like water pressure at depth. The ziggurat rises from the plain in stepped tiers, each level smaller than the one below, creating a mountain where no mountain has any right to exist in this flat expanse of alluvial sediment. The Sumerians called it Eta-Menengur, the house whose foundation creates awe, and they built it not as monument to human achievement but as something else entirely, something the excavation records would struggle to explain and the academic literature would largely choose to ignore. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley arrived at the site with funding from the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, expecting to find what archaeologists usually find in ancient Mesopotamia: broken pottery, administrative tablets, the accumulated debris of a civilization that had risen and fallen and been buried by the slow patience of sand. What he found instead, when his workers finally cleared the stairs and reached the summit platform 4 years into the dig, was a small room, perhaps 4 meters by 3, positioned at the highest point of the structure, where it would catch every breeze and overlook the entire city that had once spread below. The room had plastered walls. It had a floor worn smooth by use. It had a sleeping platform built against the northern wall, not a decorative element or a ritual symbol, but an actual bed, constructed from fired brick and surfaced with material that would have been comfortable to lie upon. Beside the platform, there was a table, the kind of surface where food might be placed for consumption. Around the table were ceramic vessels, some intact, some fragmentary, of the type used throughout Mesopotamia for storing and serving food and drink. The room had been prepared for habitation. It had been provisioned, and then it had been abandoned. Woolley, who was not a man given to flights of fancy, recognized what he had found almost immediately. The Sumerian texts he had spent years studying described a structure called the Gigunu, the sacred chamber, the bedroom of the god, the place where the divine patron of a city would descend during festivals to rest and receive the hospitality of the temple. The texts were explicit about this function. The god physically came, the god physically rested, the god physically consumed the offerings that priests carried up the endless stairs in ceramic vessels identical to the ones Woolley was now cataloguing and photographing and carefully packing in cotton for shipment to museums that would display them without quite understanding what they meant. Chemical analysis conducted decades later would confirm what Woolley suspected. The residue in those vessels was not symbolic. It was not ritual deposit meant to represent food. It was actual food, bread, beer, the organic compounds of meals actually prepared and actually left for consumption by whatever was supposed to arrive at this chamber, at the top of an artificial mountain in the middle of a city that had housed nearly 250,000 people at its height. The pattern repeated at every major site. At Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, the ziggurat dedicated to Anu contained the same arrangement. Summit chamber, sleeping platform, offering table, provisioned vessels, abandonment without destruction. At Nippur, the religious center of Sumerian civilization, the temple of Enlil showed identical features. At Eridu, the oldest of all Sumerian cities, where tradition held that kingship first descended from heaven, the sequence of temples built one atop another over 3,000 years. Each contained spaces clearly designed for divine occupation. Each eventually left empty, each maintained for centuries after whatever presence they were built to house had ceased appearing. The emptiness was not the result of violence. There were no burn layers, no evidence of conquest, no scattered bones or hasty burials that would indicate the kind of sudden catastrophe that ends occupation at most ancient sites. The emptiness was not the result of decay. The chambers had been maintained, repaired, kept in ritual readiness long after any reasonable expectation of use had passed. Priests had climbed those stairs for generations, carrying fresh offerings to replace the ones that had dried and crumbled, making beds that no one slept in, preparing meals that no one ate. The emptiness was the result of departure. Something that had been present had become absent, and the humans who had built these structures, who had maintained them with such devotion across so many centuries, had not stopped preparing. They had not stopped hoping. They had simply continued waiting generation after generation for a return that never came. The beds remained made, the tables remained set, the chambers remained ready, and the question that no excavation report adequately addresses, the question that hovers over every photograph of those summit rooms with their careful arrangements and their profound silences, is the question that will guide us through everything that follows. Who were they preparing for? The Sumerians had an answer. They left it written in clay, in thousands of tablets, in texts that scholars have spent a century and a half translating, and that still resist comfortable interpretation. They called them the Anunnaki. The word itself carries meaning that translation struggles to preserve. In Sumerian, Anunnaki breaks into components that scholars have debated since the first tablets were deciphered. The most widely accepted reading renders it as those who from heaven to earth came, or alternatively, offspring of Anu who descended. Anu was the god of the sky, the highest heaven, the most distant realm above. His offspring descended. They came down from wherever they originated to wherever humanity lived. They descended. The verb itself contains the architecture of impermanence. What descends can ascend, what comes can go. What arrives from elsewhere carries within it the structural possibility of departure. The Anunnaki were not vague spirits. They were not abstract cosmic forces personified for the convenience of primitive minds trying to explain thunder and harvest. The tablets describe them with a specificity that belongs to bureaucracy, not mythology. They had names: Enki, lord of the sweet waters that rose from beneath the earth, keeper of the divine decrees that structured civilization, the one who taught humanity agriculture and writing and the arts of survival. Enlil, lord of the air and the space between heaven and earth, the one who determined fates and issued judgments that even other gods could not overturn. Inanna, lady of love and war and the movements of Venus across the sky, whose descent to the underworld and return became the template for understanding death and resurrection. Utu, the sun itself, bringer of justice and light, who saw everything that happened beneath the sky and could be invoked as witness in legal disputes. Ninhursag, mother of the gods, shaper of life, the one who formed humans from clay in collaboration with Enki. These were not interchangeable deities performing the same functions under different names. They were distinct personalities with distinct responsibilities, capable of disagreement and alliance, of jealousy and generosity, of the full range of social interactions that characterizes beings who must negotiate with one another rather than simply impose their will. They had genealogies, the tablets trace family, trees across generations of divine beings, recording who bore whom, who married whom, who inherited what authority from what predecessor. They had responsibilities. Administrative texts describe which god presided over which city, which temple required which offerings, which festivals honoured, which divine patron according to which calendar. The specificity extends to physical description. The texts describe the Anunnaki as radiant, surrounded by light that made direct perception difficult. They describe garments that shone. They describe arrivals and conveyances that the scribes struggled to name, comparing them to birds, to fire, to things that gleamed like precious stones and moved through air in ways that ordinary objects did not. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE from older Sumerian sources, describes the Anunnaki convening an assembly to address a labour crisis. The younger gods have been working to maintain the world, and they have grown exhausted. They revolt against the senior gods, demanding relief. The assembly debates. Proposals are offered and rejected. Finally, Enki suggests creating a new kind of being, one that will assume the burden of labour so the gods can rest. The proposal is accepted. Humanity is created from clay mixed with divine essence. The crisis is resolved through administrative process and practical compromise. This is not the behavior of cosmic abstractions. This is the behavior of beings with bodies that tire, with minds that reason, with social structures that require negotiation. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that preserves older Sumerian traditions, assigns the Anunnaki specific roles in the cosmic hierarchy. Some govern celestial regions, some govern terrestrial domains, some serve as judges in divine courts. The distribution of responsibilities follows organizational logic, the kind of structure you create when you have tasks too numerous for any single entity and must delegate according to competence and authority. The temple hymns composed by Enheduanna around 2300 BCE, the earliest signed literary works in human history, describe encounters with the Anunnakis in terms that blend reverence with observation. They are powerful beyond human measure. They can reshape landscapes and determine the fates of nations, but they are not infinite. They can be bound by oaths. They can experience regret for decisions made. They can be deceived. They require sustenance. They tire, and they can leave. This is perhaps the most important characteristic, the one that separates the Anunnaki from the kind of gods that later civilizations would imagine. The Anunnaki were not permanent fixtures of the cosmos. They were visitors, long-term visitors certainly, visitors who stayed for millennia, who established civilizations, who taught and judged and intervened in human affairs with the consistency of residents rather than tourists, but visitors nonetheless, beings who had come from somewhere else and who retained the capacity to return there. The verb that appears most consistently in texts describing the Anunnaki relationship to Earth is not dwell or rule, but descend. They descended from heaven. They descended to the temples. They descended to receive offerings. Every descent implies the possibility of ascent. Every arrival contains within it the architecture of departure. And if we are to understand why the chambers at the tops of ziggurats stand empty, why the beds remain made for sleepers who never come, why the offerings dried and crumbled waiting for mouths that never arrived, we must first understand what the Anunnaki gave during the time they were present. Because what they gave reveals what they expected humanity to need, and what they expected humanity to need reveals what they knew was coming. The Sumerians called them the Emes. The word does not translate cleanly into any modern language because the concept it describes has no modern equivalent. The Emes were not laws in the sense we understand laws. They were not technologies in the sense we understand technologies. They were something closer to source codes, fundamental patterns that made specific forms of civilization possible. The tablets list them with the obsessive thoroughness that characterizes Sumerian record-keeping. There were Emes for kingship and for priesthood. There were Emes for the descent to the underworld and the ascent from it. There were Emes for truth and for the destruction of cities and for the making of Lamichtstation and for the rejoicing of the heart. There were Mes for the craft of the smith and the craft of the leather worker and the craft of the builder and the craft of the basket weaver. Each one represented not just an activity, but the fundamental pattern that made that activity possible, the template from which all specific instances derived. The myth of Inanna's journey to Eridu describes the goddess travelling to the city of Enki, and, through a combination of charm and divine alcohol convincing him to give her the Emes, she loads them onto her boat. She begins the journey back to her own city of Uruk. Enki, sobering up, realizes what he has done and sends servants to retrieve them. But Inanna has crossed the boundary. The Emes reach Uruk. The city transforms. What had been merely one settlement among many becomes the centre of civilization, the place from which all arts and all knowledge flow. The myth is not about trickery or theft, though it contains both. The myth is about transmission, about knowledge that can be moved from one place to another, about civilization as something that can be taught, that can be carried, that can be transplanted, rather than something that must be independently invented by every population that achieves it. And what were these Emes in practical terms? What did the Anunnaki actually teach? The astronomical knowledge alone defies easy explanation. Sumerian tablets track the 584-day cycle of Venus with accuracy that modern astronomers have verified. They predict lunar eclipses with precision that requires understanding the 18-year Saros cycle, a pattern so long that no individual observer could identify it from personal experience. They demonstrate awareness of precessional drift, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25 to 20 years to complete a full cycle. a phenomenon so gradual that centuries of continuous observation would be required merely to confirm its existence, let alone calculate its duration. The mathematical knowledge is equally startling. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, contain calculations involving Pythagorean triples, sets of numbers that satisfy the relationship fundamental to geometry and construction, appearing more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras would be born in Greece, and attach his name to principles that Mesopotamians had been using since before the pyramids were built. The base 60 system that the Sumerians developed and transmitted to their successors still governs our measurement of time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary numbers, they are Sumerian numbers, handed down across 5 millennia of cultural transmission, so thoroughly embedded in our daily lives that we forget they had to be invented by someone somewhere who had reason to prefer 60/10. The medical knowledge survives in tablets that modern pharmacology has examined with unexpected results. The compounds described in Sumerian medical texts, combinations of plants and minerals and other substances prescribed for specific conditions, contain biologically active ingredients that actually address the symptoms they were meant to treat. These were not magical incantations dressed in medical language. These were prescriptions that worked, based on observations of cause and effect that required careful documentation and transmission across generations. The agricultural knowledge encoded in calendars and almanacs extended far beyond the practical needs of any single farming season. The tablets describe optimal planting times and irrigation schedules and crop rotations, but they also extend these calculations into futures that no individual farmer would live to see. Calendars projecting thousands of years forward. Astronomical tables tracking cycles that would not complete until civilizations had risen and fallen multiple times. Why would anyone calculate so far ahead? Why would anyone preserve such information so carefully, encoding it in materials designed to survive fire and flood and the collapse of the societies that created them? The tablets are made of clay. Clay survives. It does not rot like papyrus or decay like wood or rust like metal. When buildings burn, clay tablets bake harder, becoming more durable rather than less. The Sumerians knew this. They chose their medium deliberately. They created records designed not just to serve immediate administrative needs, but to outlast everything else, to persist through catastrophes that would erase less permanent materials, to wait in the ruins until someone came looking for what had been preserved. The MEs were not abstractions, they were a survival kit. Agriculture to ensure food, architecture to ensure shelter, medicine to ensure health, law to ensure social organization, astronomy to ensure understanding of cycles, mathematics to ensure calculation, metallurgy to ensure tools, writing to ensure transmission, everything a civilization needs to rebuild after collapse, everything a population needs to recover from catastrophe, everything we would need if the teachers went away. They taught the Sumerians not just how to live, but how to teach others. They encoded knowledge in formats designed for survival. They built structures meant to outlast the civilizations that maintained them. They created archives that would wait millennia for translation. And then, according to every text that documents their presence, according to every empty chamber at every ziggurat summit, according to every offering that dried waiting for consumption, they left. The question is not whether they left. The evidence for departure is overwhelming. The question is why. The question is what they knew that made them decide the time had come. The question is what they were preparing us to survive. They taught us how to rebuild, but rebuild after what? The Sumerian king list reads like a photograph developing in reverse, an image that begins in impossible clarity and fades gradually into the familiar blur of ordinary history. The earliest entries describe rulers whose reigns stretch across spans of time that no human body could survive, numbers so large they seem designed to mock the very concept of mortality. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28 to 800 years. Alalgar, who followed him, reigned for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ena of Bad Tibira reigned for 43,200 years. 8 kings ruled before the flood, and their combined reigns total 241,200 years, a number that scholars have dismissed as mythological exaggeration or scribal error, or primitive misunderstanding of how time actually works. But the numbers are not random. They are not the kind of vague enormities that legends typically employ when they want to suggest great antiquity. They are precise. They are multiples of specific units. They follow mathematical patterns that only become visible when you understand the system in which they were calculated. The Sumerians measured vast time in units called sars, periods of 3,600 years, derived from their base 60 mathematical system. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals exactly 8 sars. Al-Algar's 36,000 years equals exactly 10 sars. The precision is not accidental. These were not estimates or impressions. They were calculations, measurements of epochs marked by whatever celestial or cosmic events the Sumerians used to define the boundaries of a ser. And then the flood came. The king list records it with bureaucratic brevity. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Everything changes after that line. The reigns shorten. Jushur of Kish ruled for 200 years. Kulas-Sinabel ruled for 960 years. Still impossible by modern standards, but an order of magnitude shorter than what came before. The numbers continue to decline as the list progresses. By the time we reach rulers whose existence can be confirmed through other sources, through inscriptions and monuments and administrative records, the reigns have contracted to centuries, then to decades, then to the ordinary spans of human life. Something was fading. Something that had sustained those impossible early reigns was withdrawing, diminishing, becoming less available with each generation. The pattern is not merely numerical. It appears in the language of religious texts, in the shifting vocabulary of divine encounter. The earliest temple records describe the gods with the directness of eyewitness testimony. The god comes, the god speaks, the god consumes the offering, the god rests in the chamber prepared. These are not metaphors or spiritual interpretations. They are descriptions of events that the scribes who recorded them apparently witnessed or believed their predecessors had witnessed. The verbs are concrete. The tenses are present or recent past. The gods are there physically, tangibly, in ways that require chambers with beds and tables with food. But the language changes as the centuries pass. The god comes becomes we invoke the god speaks becomes we interpret the signs. The god consumes becomes we offer and hope for acceptance. The god rests becomes we prepare the chamber and wait. The directness fades into indirection. The testimony fades into tradition. The experience fades into ritual, into the performance of forms whose original purpose has become a matter of faith rather than observation. By the time of the Babylonians, 1,000 years after the great Sumerian cities had declined, the language has completed its transformation. The texts no longer describe gods who come, they describe gods who have gone. One phrase appears repeatedly in later temple inscriptions, copied by scribes who may not have fully understood the weight of what they were transcribing. The great gods have departed to their distant abodes. Departed. The verb is final. The tense is completed action. Whatever presence had once inhabited those chambers at the tops of ziggurats, whatever beings had once descended to receive offerings and rest in beds prepared by faithful priests, they had gone somewhere else. They had withdrawn to abodes that the texts describe as distant, as removed, as beyond the reach of ordinary invocation. The Babylonians inherited the temples. They inherited the rituals. They inherited the tablets and the traditions and the careful records of how things had been done when the gods still came. But they did not inherit the presence. They maintained the forms, they climbed the stairs, they prepared the offerings, they made the beds, and they waited. For centuries they waited. Generation after generation, priests teaching priests, sons following fathers up those endless stairs to chambers that remained empty year after year. Why continue? Why maintain rituals for gods who no longer appeared? Why provision tables for mouths that never came to eat? The answer is written in the very persistence of the practice. Hope. The belief that what had departed might return. The faith that the connection, though silent, was not severed. The fear that if the ritual stopped, if the chambers were allowed to fall into disrepair, if the offering ceased, then whatever slim possibility of return remained would be extinguished forever. They kept the faith because they had nothing else to keep. They maintained the forms because the forms were all that remained of a presence that had once been as tangible as the clay beneath their feet and was now as intangible as the wind that moved through empty rooms at the tops of artificial mountains. And so the transition completed itself across a millennium of gradual diminishment. Testimony became tradition. Tradition became ritual. Ritual became hope. Hope became silence. And the chambers at the summits of ziggurats stood empty, waiting for a return that has not come in 4,000 years. The final withdrawal can be dated, approximately, to around 2000 BCE. The evidence is not a single event but a convergence of changes that cluster around this period like debris around a drain. Temple records from before this date still occasionally reference divine visitation, still describe rituals performed in expectation of presence, still maintain the language of encounter even if that language had grown increasingly formulaic and hopeful rather than experiential. Temple records from after this date do not. The shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with proclamations or theological explanations. It simply appears in the accumulation of small changes, in the subtle transformation of active verbs into passive constructions, in the gradual replacement of description with invocation, in the slow fading of a light that no one quite admits has gone out. The Babylonians who built their empire on the foundations of Sumerian civilization were not fools. They knew the difference between a god who comes and a god who is called upon. They knew that their rituals had become performances of memory rather than responses to presence. They knew that the chambers their ancestors had built with such care and provisioned with such devotion had become monuments to absence rather than dwellings for divine visitors, but they continued anyway. They continued because to stop would be to admit what no one wanted to admit, that the gods had left, that the departure was permanent, that whatever relationship had once existed between humanity and the Anunnaki had entered a new phase, a phase defined not by presence or even by occasional visitation, but by silence, by distance, by the maintenance of forms that might someday matter again, but that for now served only to mark the space where something important used to be. The beds remained made, the offerings continued, the stairs were climbed, and the waiting stretched into centuries and then into millennia, and the waiting continues still, though those who wait have forgotten what they are waiting for, and those who maintain the ruins no longer remember what the rooms at the summits were designed to accommodate. What makes this withdrawal different from what came before is precisely its permanence. The flood had been catastrophic. The texts describe it as a reset, a destruction so complete that civilization itself had to be rebuilt from fragments. But after the flood, the gods returned. Kingship descended from heaven again. The connection was re-established. The presence resumed, diminished perhaps, fading perhaps, but present nonetheless. This time there was no return. This time the departure was not a temporary withdrawal during crisis, but a permanent relocation. The gods did not descend again after 2000 BCE. They did not re-establish the connection. They did not resume the visitations that had characterized the earlier periods of Sumerian civilization. They simply remained in their distant abodes, wherever those abodes might be, and allowed the silence to become the new normal. What changed? What made this departure different from the withdrawals that had preceded it? What did the Anunnaki know that made them decide this time the leaving would be final? The answer may lie not in what they said when they left, but in what they built before they went, in the alignments they encoded into architecture, in the calculations they preserved in tablets designed to outlast empires, in the warnings they buried in foundations for future discoverers to find. The ziggurats were not merely temples, they were instruments. Every angle of their construction, every orientation of their staircases, every placement of their cornerstones aligned to celestial events with precision that challenges modern surveying equipment. The ziggurat at Ur deviates from true north by less than 1 degree across its entire foundation. The ziggurat at Uruk aligns not merely to cardinal directions, but to specific astronomical events, the winter solstice sunrise, the heliacal rising of particular stars, configurations that repeat on cycles far longer than any human lifetime. These alignments were not decorative. They were not spiritual symbolism rendered in architecture. They were functional, designed to track celestial phenomena across spans of time that exceeded the lifespan of any individual observer, any dynasty, any civilization. The SAER, that unit of 600 years that structures the impossible reigns of the pre-flood kings, is too long for any practical, human purpose. No farmer needs to know what the sky will look like in 600 years. No king needs to plan for a succession that many generations in the future. The SAR exists because something operates on that timescale, something the Sumerians tracked but could not directly observe, something whose cycles complete themselves across millennia, and whose effects, whatever they might be, required preparation that exceeded ordinary human planning horizons. The tablets found in temple foundations, deliberately buried during construction, contain astronomical data that extends far into the future. Star positions calculated for dates that had not yet arrived, planetary conjunctions that would not occur for centuries, processional drift plotted across thousands of years. These were not observations, these were predictions. These were calculations of what the sky would look like at specific future moments, encoded in materials designed to survive whatever might happen between the encoding and the moment when the predictions would become relevant. The Era and Ishum text, composed in Akkadian but drawing on older Sumerian traditions, describes future catastrophe in terms so specific they read more like warning than prophecy. The god Era announces his intention to devastate the cities of Mesopotamia. He names specific locations, he describes specific consequences. The temples will fall, the rituals will cease, the land will become desolate, the survivors will wander without direction. The text has been interpreted as retrospective, as a document composed after some historical catastrophe and dressed in prophetic language to explain suffering already experienced. But the tablet claims otherwise. It presents itself as warning. It presents itself as information about what will happen, not what has happened. It presents itself as the kind of message you leave when you are going away and you want those who remain to understand what is coming. The pattern extends beyond individual texts to the entire structure of Sumerian knowledge preservation. Agricultural calendars project thousands of years beyond any practical farming application. Mathematical tablets encode cycles of numbers whose significance only becomes apparent when you realize they correspond to astronomical periodicities that take millennia to complete. Foundation deposits, objects deliberately buried beneath temple cornerstones, contain not offerings to gods but messages to future excavators, information encoded in imperishable materials and placed in locations that would be found only when the structures above them were studied or rebuilt. The phrase that appears throughout these deposits, the phrase that scribes copied without perhaps fully understanding its implications, is from distant days. This is the restoration of what was before from distant day. This knowledge comes to us from distant days. We preserve what we received from distant days. The phrase acknowledges inheritance. It admits that the Sumerians themselves were not the source of what they knew. It positions them as transmitters rather than originators, as preservers of knowledge that came from somewhere else and someone else and some time else that the texts can only gesture toward with that vague temporal marker, distant days. They knew. The phrase echoes through every alignment, every calculation, every tablet buried for future discovery. The Anunnaki knew something that made them encode so much information in such durable forms. They knew something that made them calculate so far into the future. They knew something that made them prepare humanity for an absence that would last millennia, that made them leave behind not just knowledge, but the knowledge of how to preserve knowledge, not just survival skills, but the skills needed to transmit survival skills across generations that would have no memory of the teachers who had provided them. They knew what was coming. They knew when it was coming. They knew that humanity would need to face it without them. And so they prepared. They built structures that would outlast the civilizations that built them. They encoded astronomical alignments that would remain meaningful for thousands of years. They buried messages in foundations for future archaeologists to discover. They created a system of preservation so robust that their knowledge has survived 5 millennia of war and empire, and collapse and recovery. They gave humanity everything it would need to rebuild after catastrophe. And then they left. Not because they stopped caring. The elaborate preparations prove continued care, not because they were forced out. The systematic nature of the withdrawal suggests planning rather than crisis. They left because leaving was part of the plan. They left because their presence was needed elsewhere, or because their presence would have interfered with what humanity needed to learn, or because the coming catastrophe was one they could not or would not face alongside the beings they had created and taught and, in their way, loved. The beds remain made. The chambers remain empty. The astronomical alignments still track cycles that continue to unfold according to mathematics that does not care whether anyone is watching. And the warnings remain, encoded in architecture and buried in foundations, waiting for whoever finally learns to read them. They knew what was coming. The question we must answer is whether we can figure out what it was. The flood was not an accident. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail in the Sumerian account, the element that separates their version from the sanitized retellings that would come later. The flood was a decision. It was debated, it was voted upon, it was decreed by an assembly of beings who understood exactly what they were authorizing and chose to authorize it anyway. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets dating to around 1700 BCE, but drawing on traditions far older, describes the events with the clinical precision that characterizes Sumerian administrative records. The younger gods had been laboring to maintain the world. They dug canals, they dredged rivers, they performed the endless work that civilization requires, and after 300 years, after one full sayar of this labor, they revolted. They burned their tools, they surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator of earthly affairs. They demanded relief. The solution, as we have seen, was the creation of humanity. Beings made from clay and divine essence who would assume the burden of labor so the gods could rest. The creation succeeded. Humanity multiplied. Civilization flourished. But then a new problem emerged. Humanity had become too numerous. The noise of human activity disturbed the gods. The tablets describe this disturbance with terms that suggest more than mere annoyance, terms that imply some disruption of cosmic order, some imbalance that the proliferation of humanity had caused. Enlil convened the assembly. The gods debated. Options were proposed and rejected. Plague was attempted. Drought was attempted. Neither reduced the human population sufficiently. Finally, Enlil proposed a solution that would be comprehensive. A flood. Water that would cover the earth, that would drown every living thing, that would reset the experiment entirely and return the world to the state it had occupied before humanity cluttered its surface. The assembly agreed. The flood was decreed. And here is the detail that matters most for understanding what would happen later. They knew in advance. The flood was not a natural disaster that caught the gods by surprise. It was not an asteroid impact or a volcanic eruption or a sudden climate shift that overwhelmed divine as well as human preparations. The flood was scheduled. It was planned. It was something the gods saw coming because the gods were the ones who decided it would come. And knowing it would come, they prepared. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, dissented from the assembly's decision, but could not overrule it. What he could do was subvert it. He could not prevent the flood, but he could ensure that something followed. The method of his warning has been analysed for over a century. He did not speak directly to Ziusudra, the man he chose to preserve. Such direct communication would have violated the assembly's decree. Instead, he spoke to a wall, a reed wall behind which Ziusudra happened to be sitting. The loophole was technical, almost legalistic, the kind of workaround that allows compliance with the letter of a ruling while destroying its intent. The content of the warning was not spiritual guidance or moral instruction, it was engineering specifications. Build a boat, make it this length, this width, this height. Seal it with bitumen inside and out. Construct it with this many decks, this many compartments, this structural design. Bring aboard your family, bring craftsmen who know the essential arts, bring the seed of all living things, which scholars have interpreted as breeding pairs of animals, but which might equally mean seeds and cuttings and the genetic material necessary to restart agriculture. The flood will come on this day. It will last this long. When it ends, release birds to find land. These are not prophecies. These are protocols, survival instructions delivered by someone who knew exactly what was coming and exactly how to prepare for it. The Anunnaki themselves did not remain on Earth during the flood. The tablets describe them ascending, withdrawing to heaven, removing themselves from the surface before the waters rose. One passage describes them watching the destruction from above, crowded together at the edge of heaven, horrified by what they had decreed but unwilling or unable to stop it. Another passage describes their reaction when the waters finally receded, when Ziusudra emerged from his vessel and made offerings of thanks. The gods gathered around the sacrifice, the text says, like flies. The image is striking in its ambivalence. Divine beings, creators and destroyers of worlds, drawn to the smell of burnt offerings like insects to carrion. Hungry, perhaps regretful, perhaps merely relieved that the protocol had worked and that something had survived to feed them. After the flood, they returned. Kingship was lowered from heaven again. Civilization restarted. The connection between humanity and the Anunnaki resumed, though the texts suggest it was never quite the same. The pre-flood world had been characterized by divine presence so consistent that kings could reign for tens of thousands of years, their lives extended by proximity to beings who operated on different temporal scales. The post-flood world saw that proximity diminish, those reigns shorten, that presence fade into the pattern we have already traced, from testimony to tradition to hope to silence. But the template had been established. When catastrophe approached, the Anunnaki knew. When catastrophe approached, the Anunnaki withdrew. When catastrophe approached, they left instructions for whoever might survive, and after the catastrophe passed, at least that first time, they returned. The question that haunts every subsequent departure is why the later ones were different. Why did the permanent withdrawal around 2000 BCE not follow the flood pattern? Why did the gods not return after whatever event they anticipated? What made them decide that this time the leaving would be final? Part of the answer may lie in what happened to the civilizations they left behind. The Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE stands as one of the most dramatic and least understood catastrophes in human history. Within a span of roughly 50 years, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or contracted into a shadow of its former complexity. The destruction was simultaneous, comprehensive, and devastating in ways that no single explanation has ever adequately addressed. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries and challenged Egypt for regional supremacy, simply ceased to exist. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BCE. The royal archives that had documented generations of diplomacy and conquest were left to the elements. The trade networks that had connected Hittite merchants to ports across the Mediterranean severed, as if someone had cut the strings of a vast puppet. No successor state emerged. No conqueror claimed the territory. The empire dissolved into silence and ruin. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece collapsed in the same decades. The palace complexes that had administered trade and warfare and religious observance across the Aegean were destroyed one after another. Pylos burned, Tiryns burned. Mycenae itself, the city of Agamemnon if the later legends preserve any historical memory, contracted from a thriving administrative centre to a diminished settlement that would never recover its former significance. The writing system that had recorded Mycenaean Greek vanished entirely. For nearly 4 centuries following the collapse, Greece would be illiterate. The memory of palatial civilization preserved only in oral traditions that would eventually crystallize into the epics attributed to Homer. Cyprus fell. Ugarit fell. The coastal cities of the Levant fell. The destruction was so simultaneous, so geographically comprehensive that early scholars assumed a single conquering force must have swept through the region like wildfire through dry grass. They called this hypothetical force the Sea Peoples, a name borrowed from Egyptian inscriptions that describe waves of invaders arriving by ship to attack the Nile Delta around 1178 BC. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III, depict naval battles and land engagements against confederations of warriors whose names the Egyptians recorded, but whose origins remain mysterious. The Peliset, who may have become the Philistines, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, names that scholars have tried to connect to known populations, some perhaps ancestral to historical peoples, others vanishing from the record as completely as the civilizations they allegedly destroyed. But the Sea People's explanation fails under scrutiny. A conquering force leaves victors. It leaves successor states that occupy conquered territory. It leaves archaeological evidence of new cultural practices replacing old ones. The Bronze Age collapse left none of this. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, did not build empires on the ruins of the civilizations they attacked. They did not occupy the destroyed cities. They did not impose their language or religion or administrative systems on conquered populations. They appear in the record as destroyers and then disappear. Modern scholarship has proposed multiple explanations that operate together rather than alone. Climate data extracted from tree rings and lake sediments reveals that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought during this period. Crop failures cascaded through interconnected agricultural systems. Trade networks that had distributed tin and copper, the essential ingredients of bronze, fractured as ports burned and shipping lanes became impassable. The palace economies that had organized late Bronze Age civilization were too complex and too interdependent. When one node failed, the failure propagated to every connected node. The system was fragile precisely because it was sophisticated, but none of these explanations, individually or collectively, fully account for what happened. Droughts affect regions differently. Trade disruptions benefit some powers while harming others. Internal rebellions overthrow governments without erasing entire civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse erased civilizations across an entire region simultaneously, and it did so in ways that left survivors unable or unwilling to rebuild using the knowledge and institutions that had existed before. The timing matters. The collapse occurred roughly 800 years after the final withdrawal of the Anunnaki. 8 centuries of diminishing guidance, of fading presence, of traditions maintained without the teachers who had established them. 8 centuries during which the knowledge encoded in Sumerian tablets was transmitted and copied and gradually misunderstood, during which the astronomical alignments lost their practical meaning and became mere architecture, during which the survival protocols became rituals and the rituals became empty forms. The civilizations that collapsed in 1200 BC were not Sumerian. They were inheritors of Sumerian knowledge, recipients of transmission that had passed through multiple cultural translations. They had the mathematics, but perhaps not the understanding of what the mathematics tracked. They had the astronomy, but perhaps not the recognition of what the astronomy warned about. They had the forms, but not the function. And when whatever the Sumerians had prepared for finally arrived, they were not ready. The Sumerians understood time differently than we do. They did not see history as a line extending from primitive past to advanced future. They saw it as a wheel, a cycle of ages that repeated according to patterns encoded in the movements of stars. The Great Year, the period required for the celestial sphere to complete one full rotation relative to the solar equinoxes, lasts approximately 2520 years. The Sumerians knew this. Their astronomical tablets track the slow drift of constellations against seasonal markers with precision that modern astronomers have verified. They divided this great year into smaller segments, ages characterized by different celestial configurations, different qualities, different dangers. The transitions between ages were not smooth. They were thresholds, points of potential disruption, where the patterns that governed one age gave way and the patterns of the next age had not yet stabilized. These transitions were dangerous precisely because they were transitions, moments when the rules changed and what had worked before might not work again. The SAR, that period of 300 years that appears throughout Sumerian calculation, represents one division of cosmic time. It is close to 1/7 of the Great Year. It aligns with certain planetary conjunctions that repeat on multi-millennial timescales. It corresponds to cycles that modern astronomy is only beginning to identify, and that ancient astronomy tracked with methods we are only beginning to understand. Modern science has discovered that the solar system moves through space in ways that affect conditions on Earth. Our Sun orbits the galactic center, carrying its planets through regions of varying density, through streams of debris left by comets and asteroids, through zones where gravitational influences differ from what we experience in our current position. The journey takes roughly 225 million years to complete, but within that vast orbit are smaller oscillations, shorter cycles, during which Earth passes through environments more or less hospitable to the life that clings to its surface. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 12,800 years ago, shortly before the date suggested by the geological evidence for a massive flood in Mesopotamia, Earth encountered something catastrophic. Perhaps a comet, perhaps a swarm of debris, perhaps something that struck the Greenland ice sheet and triggered rapid climate change, mass extinctions, and the collapse of whatever cultures existed at that time. The evidence remains debated, but the timing is suggestive. 12,800 years ago is roughly half a precessional cycle before the present. It aligns with the kind of cosmic periodicity that the Sumerians encoded in their astronomical calculations. It falls within the range of dates suggested by flood myths worldwide, stories of waters rising and worlds ending, and small groups of survivors rebuilding from fragments. If the Anunnaki tracked these cycles, if their astronomical knowledge extended to patterns that operate on timescales of thousands or tens of thousands of years, then their departures might not have been arbitrary, they might have been calculated. Time to precede moments of maximum danger. Evacuations executed before predictable catastrophe arrived. The flood would have been one such moment, a cycle completing, a dangerous threshold approaching. The gods foresaw it, decreed it, used it to reset a world that had become imbalanced. They withdrew to safety, watched from above, returned when the danger passed. The withdrawal around 2000 BCE might have been preparation for another such moment, another cycle approaching, another threshold that would bring instability or destruction, but this time, for reasons the tablets do not explain, the return did not happen. Perhaps the cycle was longer than before, perhaps the danger was greater, perhaps these? Anunnaki calculated that humanity would need to face this one alone, that continued guidance would prevent the development of capacities that survival would require. Or perhaps the event they anticipated has not yet occurred. Perhaps the withdrawal was preparation for something still coming. Perhaps the ziggurats still tracking celestial cycles, the tablets still waiting in museum archives, the warnings still encoded in foundations and alignments, and mathematical progressions were never meant for the Bronze Age civilizations that failed to decode them. Perhaps they were meant for us. The cycles continue to turn. The constellations drift. The ages that the Sumerians calculated approach their transitions. Whatever they knew, whatever they prepared for, whatever made them decide to leave and not return, the time encoded in their monuments continues to unfold. And somewhere in that unfolding, in the mathematics of celestial mechanics that does not care whether anyone is watching, the event they anticipated draws closer. Or perhaps it has already begun. Perhaps we are living through it now, unable to recognize its early stages, because we lost the ability to read the warnings they left. Perhaps the catastrophe they foresaw is not a single moment, but a process, a gradual unraveling that looks from inside like normal historical change and only becomes visible as catastrophe when you have the perspective of thousands of years and the mathematics to calculate what comes next. They knew. The flood proves they could know, the departure proves they knew something else. The question is whether we can recover enough of what they encoded to understand what is coming, and whether we can use what they taught to survive it. The pattern repeats across continents and millennia with a consistency that resists comfortable explanation. In the highlands of the Andes, where the air thins and the mountains rise into clouds that indigenous peoples once believed were the dwelling places of gods, the oldest traditions speak of Viracocha. He came from the east, or perhaps from the sea, or perhaps from the sky itself, depending on which version of the story you encounter. What remains consistent across all versions is what he did. He found humanity primitive and struggling. He taught them agriculture, architecture, the measurement of time, the organization of society, the arts that transform survival into civilization. He established laws and rituals. He showed them how to read the sky and mark the seasons. And then, when his teaching was complete, he walked across the Pacific Ocean and disappeared. He did not die. He was not killed or overthrown or defeated by rivals. He simply left, walking westward across the water toward the setting sun, promising that he or his emissaries would return when the cycle completed, when the age turned, when humanity needed teaching again. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec preserved memories of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a figure of wisdom associated with wind and learning and the morning star. The stories are complex and have accumulated layers across centuries of retelling, but the core structure remains recognizable. He came from somewhere else. He brought knowledge that transformed society. He taught writing and mathematics and the calendar systems that measured not just seasons but ages, vast cycles of creation and destruction extending tens of thousands of years into past and future. He established the foundations upon which Mesoamerican civilization would build for millennia. And then he left. He departed toward the east, toward the rising sun, after conflict with darker powers, or after completing some mission that the stories no longer fully remember. He promised to return. He promised that when the current age ended, when the cosmic cycle completed its turn, he would come back from the direction he had gone, from across the eastern sea. The expectation of his return shaped Mesoamerican religion for centuries afterward. Priests calculated the dates when his arrival might occur, rituals oriented toward the eastern horizon. When Spanish ships appeared from that direction in 1519, when bearded strangers arrived from across the waters that Quetzalcoatl had crossed, some wondered if the ancient promise was being fulfilled. They were wrong, of course, but the expectation itself reveals how deeply the departure and the promise of return had embedded themselves in cultural memory. In Egypt, the earliest dynastic records speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an age when divine beings ruled directly and established the foundations upon which all subsequent civilization would rest. Among these beings was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom credited with inventing writing and establishing the calendar and teaching humanity the arts of measurement and magic and the principles that govern the relationship between heaven and earth. Thoth did not die in Egyptian mythology. He ascended. He withdrew to celestial realms after ensuring that his knowledge had been encoded in temples and texts and the training of priests who would maintain the transmission across generations. His departure was not defeat, it was completion. The ending of a teaching phase that had accomplished its purpose. The Hebrew tradition preserves its own version in texts that circulated widely in the ancient world even if they did not enter the canonical Bible. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, a class of celestial beings who descended to earth and taught humanity knowledge that had been forbidden. They revealed the secrets of metallurgy and cosmetics and the reading of celestial signs. They intermarried with humans, producing hybrid offspring. And before the flood came, before the catastrophe that would reset civilization, they withdrew. They ascended back to their celestial origins, leaving behind transformed humans and forbidden knowledge, and the certainty that the world they had shaped was about to be destroyed. The Babylonians, inheritors of Sumerian tradition, preserved memories of the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea in the time before the flood. The most famous of these was Oannes, described by the Babylonian priest Berossus, in accounts that survive only in fragments quoted by later Greek writers. Oannes had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish form was the figure of a man. He emerged from the waters each day to teach humanity writing, architecture, agriculture, the arts of civilization. Each evening he returned to the sea, to whatever realm existed beneath the waters. He taught for a generation, and then he departed, returning to the depths from which he had come. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Beings arrive from elsewhere, from the sky, from the sea, from across waters, from the east or the west or above. They find humanity in a primitive state. They teach. They establish the foundations of civilization. They encode their knowledge in durable forms. They warn of catastrophe to come, and then they leave. They return to wherever they came from. They promise sometimes to come back. They leave behind transformed populations and accumulated knowledge and the certainty that something important has ended and something uncertain has begun. The easy explanation is coincidence. Every culture invents origin stories. Every culture attributes its achievements to founding figures who seem larger than ordinary humanity. Every culture imagines teachers and guides who explain how the world came to be the way it is. The structural similarities reflect universal human psychology, not shared memory or common experience. But the details resist this comfortable dismissal. The method of departure is too consistent. The promise of return is too specific. The timing relative to catastrophe is too precise. The nature of the knowledge transmitted is too practical, too survival-oriented, too much like a curriculum designed for a specific purpose rather than a mythology designed to glorify ancestors or explain natural phenomena. Either humanity spontaneously generated functionally identical narratives about departing teachers across every inhabited continent, with no contact between the generating cultures, or the narratives preserve something. A common memory, a shared experience, an event or a pattern of events that affected human populations worldwide and left traces in cultural memory that persist even now, 5,000 or 10,000 or 12,000 years later. The promise of return echoes through all of these traditions. Quetzalcoatl will come back from the east when the age completes. Viracocha will return when humanity needs teaching again. The Anunnaki have departed to their distant abodes, but the phrase distant does not mean permanent. It means far away, removed, beyond ordinary reach, but not beyond all reach. The chambers at the tops of ziggurats were maintained for centuries after any reasonable expectation of visitation had passed. The beds remained made, the offerings continued. The rituals that had once responded to presence transformed into rituals that invited presence, that called out across whatever distance separated humanity from its departed teachers, that maintained the forms in hope that maintaining the forms would somehow matter. The waiting became encoded in religion itself, the expectation of return, of a future moment when what had departed would come back, when guidance would resume, when the silence would break and the teachers would descend again to find their students ready and faithful. Messianic traditions across cultures may preserve this pattern, the hope that someone is coming, that the long absence will end, that whatever humanity has endured alone will finally be relieved by the return of those who left. Whether this hope reflects genuine promise or merely the projection of human need onto the blank screen of departed divinity is a question no one can answer with certainty. Perhaps the Anunnaki, or whatever we choose to call the beings who appear under different names in different cultures, genuinely intended to return. Perhaps the distant abodes are temporary refuges, places to wait out whatever cosmic event prompted the withdrawal, staging areas from which descent might someday resume. Or perhaps the promise of return was kindness, the gift you give to those you are leaving behind, knowing you will not see them again, but wanting to spare them the desolation of that knowledge. the hope that allows the waiting to feel meaningful rather than futile. The structures the teachers left behind speak to planning rather than crisis. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia did not fall to conquest or famine or plague. They emptied gradually, systematically, over periods that suggest controlled departure rather than desperate flight. When archaeologists excavated Uruk in the early 20th century, they expected to find evidence of the violence that typically ends urban occupation. Burn layers, mass graves, scattered possessions abandoned in haste, signs of the chaos that accompanies conquest or catastrophe. What they found instead was more unsettling than violence. They found a city that had emptied in orderly fashion. Populations had declined steadily over centuries without the demographic shocks that warfare or epidemic would produce. Temples had been carefully closed rather than destroyed. Sacred objects had been removed rather than looted. Administrative records had been archived with the same meticulous attention to order that characterized Sumerian bureaucracy at its height. The city had not been destroyed. It had been evacuated. Eridu, the oldest of all Sumerian cities, shows the same pattern even more starkly. The temple complex that had been continuously rebuilt and expanded for 5,000 years simply stopped receiving new construction around 2000 BCE. The final temple layer shows no damage. There is no evidence of violence or hasty abandonment. The offerings had been removed. The sacred implements had been taken elsewhere. The structure had been deliberately sealed, closed with ritual precision as though those departing knew they would not return and wanted to preserve what remained for whoever might come later. Precious objects remained throughout both cities. Gold and lapis lazuli and cylinder seals that represented personal identity and legal authority. The kinds of valuables that refugees carry when fleeing disaster and that looters seize when pillaging abandoned settlements. These objects stayed where they had been placed, undisturbed, as though the departure had followed protocols that prioritized certain knowledge and certain artifacts over material wealth, as though those leaving knew exactly what mattered and what did not. Someone organized this. Someone knew when to leave and what to take and what to preserve, and how to close a city that had flourished for millennia so that its records and its structures would survive for future discoverers to study. The cities were not destroyed. The cities were not abandoned in panic. The cities were systematically emptied according to plans that must have been developed in advance, executed over generations, completed with the patience and precision that characterized everything the Sumerians built. The same patterns appears at site after site across Mesopotamia. Populations declining without demographic crisis, temples closing without violence, archives preserved without disorder. The infrastructure of civilization shut down like a machine being carefully deactivated rather than destroyed like a machine being smashed. Whatever the Sumerians knew, whatever prompted this organized withdrawal, the evidence suggests it was not surprise. They saw it coming. They prepared. They left in good order, taking what mattered, preserving what might be needed, closing the doors behind them in ways that would allow others to open those doors millennia later and find what had been saved. The question that rises from every evacuated city, every sealed temple, every carefully archived tablet, is the question that connects everything we have traced through these hours. What did they know? What made them leave? What were they preparing for? And does whatever they anticipated still lie in the future, waiting for the cycles they calculated to complete their long, slow turning toward the event that made the gods themselves decide it was time to go? The mud brick that built Mesopotamia was not chosen for convenience or economy. It was chosen for survival. The alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates offered no stone quarries, no forests of timber, nothing that other civilizations used to construct monuments intended to outlast their builders. There was only clay, endless deposits of river sediment that could be shaped and dried and stacked into structures that would, with proper engineering, persist for millennia. The Sumerians understood this material in ways that modern architects are still analyzing. They knew that mud brick absorbs water and swells and eventually dissolves if exposed to moisture without protection. They knew that the rare but devastating rains that swept across Mesopotamia could destroy in hours what had taken years to build. So they developed techniques. They waterproofed their most important structures with bitumen, the thick petroleum derivative that seeps from natural deposits throughout the region. They designed their ziggurats with drainage systems that channeled water away from vulnerable surfaces. They baked the exterior bricks in kilns, creating a shell of ceramic that protected the sun-dried core, and they built in steps, in tiers, in configurations that distributed weight efficiently and prevented the compression failures that would have collapsed simpler designs. The ziggurats were engineered to endure, not for decades or centuries, but for millennia. The ziggurat at Ur, partially reconstructed in modern times, preserves its original core from nearly 4,000 years ago. The ziggurat at Shogazambil in Iran, though never completed by its original builders, still rises over 80 feet from foundations laid in the 13th century BCE. These structures have survived longer in their original form than the pyramids of Egypt, which have lost their outer casing and much of their original profile to erosion and stone robbing. The Sumerians built to last because they expected their buildings to be needed. When archaeologists excavated the foundations of major ziggurats, they discovered something that confirmed this intentionality beyond any reasonable doubt. Foundation deposits, deliberate caches of objects placed beneath cornerstone blocks during construction, positioned to survive whatever happened to the superstructure above, designed to be found when the structures were eventually excavated or rebuilt. These deposits were not offerings, in the religious sense. They were not gifts to gods or sacrifices meant to consecrate the ground. They were messages, time capsules buried by people who knew that someday someone would dig down to the foundations and find what had been hidden. The contents of these deposits varied but followed consistent patterns. Clay cylinders inscribed with texts describing the building's purpose and the name of the king who commissioned it, figurines of protective deities, and tablets containing astronomical observations, mathematical formulas, building specifications, knowledge encoded in clay and placed in the one location certain to survive fire, flood, conquest, abandonment, and the slow grinding of centuries. The texts inscribed on these foundation deposits often include phrases that make their intended audience explicit. Future kings who would restore what time had damaged, future builders who would excavate the foundations to understand what had been built before, future discoverers who would find the messages and learn what their predecessors had known. They were addressing us. Across 4,000 years, across the collapse of empires and the extinction of languages and the burial of entire civilizations beneath sand and silt, they were writing to whoever would eventually dig. They built to last because they knew we would come looking. They buried messages because they knew we would find them. They encoded knowledge in imperishable materials because they knew that knowledge would be needed by people who did not yet exist, in an era they could not imagine, facing circumstances they could only calculate in the abstract mathematics of cosmic cycles. The tablets are messages in bottles thrown into the ocean of time, and we are the shipwrecked sailors who finally found them washed up on the shore of the present, 4,000 years after they were cast into the current. The knowledge they chose to preserve reveals what they considered essential for survival. Not poetry, though the Sumerians composed poetry. Not history in the narrative sense, though they recorded the reigns of kings. Not mythology for its own sake, though they preserved the stories of gods and heroes. What they prioritized, what they encoded most carefully and buried most deliberately, and copied most obsessively across generations of scribal transmission, was practical knowledge. The knowledge that would allow whoever survived to rebuild after whatever was coming had finished destroying what existed. Astronomy above all, the positions of stars and the movements of planets and the cycles that repeat across timescales exceeding human lifespans. Not astrology in the fortune-telling sense, but pattern recognition at cosmic scale. The ability to know where you stand in sequences too vast for direct observation. The capacity to anticipate what comes next by understanding what has come before. If catastrophe operates on cycles, if the events that end ages repeat according to celestial mathematics, then tracking those cycles is not academic curiosity, it is survival strategy. Mathematics next. The base 60 system that allows division into many factors, the geometry that enables construction and surveying, the calculation methods that permit prediction and planning, the numbers themselves preserved in tablets and transmitted across generations, not as abstract theory but as practical technique. How to measure, how to compute, how to project patterns into futures you will not live to see. Medicine preserved with the same practical emphasis. Which plants treat which conditions, which compounds address which symptoms, how to maintain the biological machinery of human bodies when illness and injury threaten. The knowledge of healing encoded in tablets that modern pharmacology has examined and found to contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. Agriculture documented in calendars and almanacs. When to plant, when to harvest, how to irrigate, how to rotate. Crops to maintain soil fertility. The knowledge that transforms land into food and food into the surplus that makes civilization possible. Law preserved in codes that predate the famous Hammurabi by centuries. How to organize society, how to resolve disputes without violence, how to allocate property and punish wrongdoing and maintain the cooperation that allows strangers to live together in cities. Architecture encoded in building specifications and foundation texts. How to construct shelters that survive. How to engineer structures that outlast their builders. How to create the physical infrastructure that houses and protects and enables everything else. The MEs, those divine codes of civilization, were exactly this. Not mystical abstractions, but practical curricula. Everything needed to restart civilization from scratch. Everything required to rebuild after collapse. Everything we would need if the teachers went away and the students had to manage on their own. The emphasis throughout Sumerian texts is not on creation, but on restoration. This is the restoration of what was before. We preserve what was given to us from distant days. The knowledge comes to us from earlier times. The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors standing at the beginning of history. They saw themselves as inheritors in the middle of a cycle, custodians of knowledge that had been passed down and would need to be passed further. Links in a chain of transmission that extended backward beyond memory and forward beyond imagination. They taught the Sumerians not just how to live, but how to teach others. The scribal schools that trained generations of students were not merely vocational institutions, they were transmission systems. They ensured that knowledge encoded in tablets would be copied and recopied, that the chain would not break, that whatever happened to individual cities or kingdoms or empires, the core curriculum would survive. The Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, did not merely give information. They gave the system for preserving information. They gave the method for transmitting knowledge across generations. They gave humanity not just fish, but the ability to fish, and not just the ability to fish, but the ability to teach fishing to people who had never seen water. They prepared us to survive without them, and then they tested that preparation by leaving. The silence that has lasted 4,000 years is itself a communication. The absence speaks as clearly as presence ever could. If we are willing to listen to what it says, they withdrew gradually. The fading we trace through the timeline of the king list, the transformation from direct presence to occasional visitation to dreams and omens to empty ritual was not for failure. It was pedagogy. Each stage forced humanity to rely more heavily on what had been learned, to consult tablets rather than teachers, to develop capacities that would atrophy if guidance remained constantly available. Teachers, who never leave, create students who never grow. Knowledge received is not the same as knowledge earned. The capacity to survive does not develop in those who are always protected from threat. If the Anunnaki intended humanity to face whatever was coming, if they calculated that we would need to handle it without divine intervention, then the withdrawal was not abandonment. It was training. The silence is the space in which development occurs. The absence is the condition that forces capability to emerge. Perhaps they left because we were ready. Perhaps they calculated that the transmission was complete, that the knowledge had been encoded, that the systems for preservation and teaching were robust enough to function without oversight. Perhaps the departure was graduation, the recognition that students had learned what they needed and could now proceed independently. Or perhaps they left because we had to be ready, whether we were or not. Perhaps the cycles they tracked permitted no delay. Perhaps the event they anticipated would arrive on its own schedule regardless of whether humanity had achieved sufficient development. Perhaps the preparation was as complete as time allowed, and whatever came next would test whether the preparation was enough. Or perhaps the test is precisely the surviving without them. Perhaps what they needed to see, or what the cosmic pattern required, was whether beings created from clay and divine essence could face catastrophe alone. Perhaps we are being watched from those distant abodes, observed across whatever distance separates us from departed teachers, evaluated on our capacity to use what we were given when using it matters most. We cannot know which interpretation is correct. We cannot know whether the departure was confidence or necessity, graduation or abandonment, trust or resignation. We cannot know whether they expected us to succeed or merely hoped we might. We cannot know whether the silence indicates satisfaction or sorrow, whether they watch with pride as we approach whatever they anticipated, or whether they have turned their attention elsewhere and forgotten the experiment they once conducted in the mud between two rivers. What we can know is what they left behind: the tablets, the temples, the alignments, the calendars, the foundation deposits buried for us to find, the complete curriculum for rebuilding civilization after collapse. The messages in bottles that have finally washed up on our shore. 4,000 years after casting carrying knowledge, we are only beginning to decode. The gift of knowledge was also the gift of independence. Whatever they foresaw, whatever made them decide to leave, they did not leave us helpless. They did not abandon children in the wilderness. They left us equipped. They left us prepared. They left us with everything we would need, encoded in materials designed to outlast whatever was coming, waiting in the ruins for whoever learned to read the wedge-shaped marks and understand what had been preserved. The silence continues. The waiting continues. But the message they left in that silence is not despair. It is instruction. And the question is not whether they abandoned us or trusted us. The question is whether we will use what they gave. In a climate-controlled basement archive in London or Berlin or Philadelphia, in a drawer that may not have been opened in years, a clay tablet rests on padded foam. The room is dark because light degrades organic materials, and because no one is there to need illumination. The temperature holds steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity is monitored by sensors that would alert staff if it rose above acceptable levels. The tablet has been catalogued and numbered and photographed and filed in databases that track its provenance and dimensions, and the scholarly literature that references it. It has been handled perhaps a dozen times since its excavation a century ago. It will be handled perhaps a dozen more times in the next century, when researchers with specific questions request access and don cotton gloves and lift it carefully from its padded tray to examine the wedge-shaped marks that cover its surface. The tablet is one of hundreds of thousands. The collections of the British Museum alone contain over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, most of them unstudied, their contents unknown, their messages unread. They sit in storage drawers and archive boxes, patient beyond human patience, holding words that scribes pressed into wet clay when the pyramids were new and the gods still answered when called. If you could hold one of these tablets, if protocol permitted and circumstance allowed, you would feel the weight of fired earth that has not been warm since the day it was shaped. You would feel the slight roughness where time has weathered the surface. You would see the marks, the small triangular impressions made by a reed stylus pressed at angles into wet clay. Hundreds of marks per tablet, each one a phonetic syllable or an ideographic concept or a numerical value depending on context and combination. And if you looked closely at the edges, at the places where the scribe's hands shaped the clay before the stylus began its work, you might see them. Fingerprints, the whorls and ridges of human thumbs preserved in the moment before the clay hardened, frozen there across 5,000 years. Those prints belonged to someone who lived and worked and believed that what they were making mattered. Someone who sat in a scriptorium or a temple school, who took wet clay in one hand and a reed tool in the other, who pressed symbols into mud with the certainty that meaning would outlast empires. They did not know our names. They could not have imagined our cities or our technologies or the languages we would speak. But they knew we were coming. They knew that someday someone would find what they were making, would learn to read the marks, would receive the message they were encoding for exactly this purpose. The Sumerian scribes did not understand themselves as inventors. This is perhaps the most important thing we can recover from their writings, the key that makes sense of every mystery we have traced. They called themselves preservers. They called their work restoration. They said that what they recorded came from before, from distant days, from times and sources they could only gesture toward with phrases that acknowledged inheritance rather than origination. This is the restoration of what was before. The phrase appears in foundation deposits and temple inscriptions and royal proclamations, always the same confession. We did not create this, we received it, we pass it on. They saw themselves as links in a chain, inheritors of a mission to remember, custodians of knowledge that had been entrusted to them and that they were obligated to transmit to whoever came after. The tablets were not records in the archival sense, documents created for contemporary administrative purposes and incidentally preserved. The tablets were testimony, deliberately encoded, deliberately preserved, deliberately addressed to future readers who would need what they contained. We are the intended audience. We are the recipients of a transmission that began 5,000 years ago and has only now, in the last century and a half, begun to be decoded. The fingerprints in clay are reaching across time, and the hands that made them are touching ours. The pattern we have traced through these hours follows a structure that suggests repetition. Knowledge descends. Beings from elsewhere arrive and teach and establish the foundations of civilization. The populations they teach flourish under guidance, building cities and developing arts and accumulating the complexity that transforms scattered tribes into interconnected societies. Then the teachers withdraw. Gradually at first, direct presence fading into occasional visitation, visitation fading into indirect communication, communication fading into silence. The withdrawal coincides with warnings, with preparations, with knowledge encoded in durable forms and buried in foundations, and aligned to celestial events that will not occur for centuries or millennia. Then catastrophe strikes. Whatever the teachers foresaw arrives. Civilizations collapse, populations scatter. The complexity that had been achieved dissolves into simpler forms, and the survivors struggle to remember what their ancestors had known. Then rebuilding begins, from fragments, from tablets preserved in ruins, from oral traditions that carry echoes of written knowledge, from the survival skills encoded by departed teachers in materials designed to outlast whatever destroyed everything else. The survivors rebuild using what was left for them, and the cycle repeats. Where are we in this pattern? The question is not rhetorical. If the cycles the Sumerians tracked are real, if cosmic events repeat according to mathematics that does not care whether anyone is watching, then our position in the sequence matters. We may be in a flourishing phase, building complexity, accumulating knowledge, enjoying the fruits of civilizations that have developed without divine interruption for 4,000 years. Or we may be approaching a transition, a threshold, a moment when whatever ended previous ages prepares to arrive again. The concerns that animate modern discussions of existential risk carry echoes of Sumerian anxiety. We worry about climate change, about the cascading failures that could result from systems too complex and too interdependent. We worry about nuclear weapons, about the capacity we have developed to destroy ourselves. We worry about pandemic disease, about artificial intelligence, about the dozen scenarios that futurists and philosophers have identified as potential civilization-ending events, and we prepare. We build seed vaults in Arctic mountains, preserving the genetic diversity of food crops against whatever might threaten agriculture. We launch cultural records into deep space, encoding the achievements of human civilization in materials designed to outlast our planet. We develop digital preservation strategies, attempting to ensure that knowledge encoded in electronic formats will remain accessible across technological changes that might render current storage media unreadable. We are doing exactly what the Sumerians did. We are encoding survival knowledge. We are burying messages for future discoverers. We are preparing for catastrophe we hope will not come, while calculating that hope alone is insufficient. The materials have changed, clay has become silicon, bitumen has become radiation-hardened storage, ziggurats have become data centers and orbital archives, but the urgency is identical. The sense that knowledge must be preserved against discontinuity, the awareness that civilizations are fragile, the determination to leave something that will help whoever comes after. We have joined the chain of transmission. We have become custodians of memory. We are doing consciously what the Sumerians did under instruction, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the long silence was meant to produce exactly this, a humanity that preserves without being told, that prepares without being guided, that has internalized the mission of the departed teachers so completely that we now execute it on our own initiative. The waiting continues. In museum archives around the world, the tablets breathe their slow breath in darkness, holding messages that have waited millennia for translation. Each tablet decoded is a message finally received. Each text interpreted extends a conversation that began before history had a name. Each fragment fitted to another fragment completes a picture that has been waiting since the beginning to be seen whole. But most tablets remain unread. Most messages remain unreceived. Libraries of material sit in storage, their contents unknown, their warnings unheeded, their instructions unfollowed because no one has yet taken the time to learn what they say. What else did they tell us? What knowledge remains encoded in tablets that have not been examined since their excavation a century ago? What warnings wait in archives for scholars who may never come, for funding that may never materialize, for attention that the modern world may never spare for voices so ancient they predate everything we think we know? The questions that remain are the questions we began with. Will they return? The Anunnaki, or whatever we choose to call the beings who appear under different names in different cultures, the teachers who departed to their distant abodes, The presence that once filled those chambers at the tops of ziggurats and has been absent for 4,000 years, will the cycles they tracked eventually bring them back? Will the completion of whatever cosmic sequence prompted their withdrawal also signal the resumption of contact? Should they return, would we want them to? We have developed in their absence capacities they may not have anticipated. We have become in some ways godlike ourselves, reshaping our environment, extending our senses across the cosmos, accumulating knowledge at rates that dwarf anything previous generations achieved. Would we welcome the return of teachers, or have we become something that no longer needs teaching? Has the silence taught us what presence could not? Has the withdrawal forced development that guidance would have prevented? Has the absence been, in some paradoxical way, the greatest gift they could have given, the space in which humanity became whatever we have become? The chambers remain empty, the beds remain made, the offerings have long since crumbled into dust, and we wait, as humanity has waited since the departure began, for an answer that may never come, for a return that may never happen, for a resolution to a story that the silence refuses to provide. But perhaps the waiting is the answer. Perhaps the silence is the resolution. Perhaps what they left us, all they left us, is enough. The desert wind passes over Iraq in the hours before dawn, moving across a landscape that has witnessed more history than any human mind can hold. It comes from the south, from where the Tigris and Euphrates once braided together before emptying into the Persian Gulf, and it carries with it the taste of salt and dust and distances that have no names in any living language. The ziggurat at Ur rises from the plain in the grey light, its stepped profile emerging from darkness like a memory surfacing from sleep. The mud brick has endured for 4,000 years, weathered and patched and partially reconstructed by archaeologists who understood what they were preserving, even if they could not fully explain why it mattered. The stairs that climb the southern face are the same stairs that priests once climbed, carrying offerings in ceramic vessels, ascending toward chambers where gods were supposed to rest. The wind has not stopped moving across these ruins since the last priest ascended for the final time. It has carried away particles of mud brick, grain by grain, redistributing what was once temple wall across the desert floor. Some of that dust has travelled far, some has settled nearby, mixing with the sand that buries and reveals and buries again, the fragments of a civilization that rose to heights we are only beginning to understand and fell for reasons we can only hypothesize. In the modern era, tourists occasionally visit. They climb the reconstructed stairs, pausing to photograph the view across the empty plain, rarely understanding what the structure was built to do, or what once happened in the small chamber at its summit. They see ancient architecture. They see archaeological site. They do not see the beds that were made for visitors who stopped coming, the offerings that dried, waiting for mouths that never arrived, the hope that persisted in architectural form centuries after any reasonable expectation had passed. The Jigunu remains, that sacred bedroom, that chamber for divine rest, the room where the Anunnaki were supposed to descend and receive the hospitality of the temple, stands at the summit, restored enough to suggest its original form, empty as it has been empty since before Rome was founded, since before Greece had philosophers, since before any civilization that most people can name had risen to prominence. 4,000 years of absence, 4,000 years of silence, 4,000 years of wind moving through a chamber that was built for presence and has known only absence for longer than Christianity or Islam or Buddhism has existed. And yet the silence is not empty. It is full of everything that was preserved, full of the tablets buried in foundations, full of the astronomical alignments still tracking cycles, full of the knowledge encoded in clay and bitumen and the careful engineering of structures designed to outlast whatever was coming. The absence speaks. It says, "We were here, we taught, we prepared, we left." The meaning of the departure resists singular interpretation. We cannot know, across 4,000 years of silence, what motivated beings whose nature we can only infer from texts that may be testimony, or may be mythology, or may be something for which we have no adequate category. Perhaps they abandoned us. Perhaps they grew weary of the experiment they had conducted in the mud between two rivers, and returned to their distant abodes without concern for what would happen to the creatures they had created and taught. Perhaps the silence is indifference. Perhaps we were never more than a project that lost their interest. Or perhaps they prepared us. Perhaps they calculated that the knowledge they had encoded would be sufficient. Perhaps they ran the mathematics and determined that humanity had what it needed to survive whatever was coming, that continued presence would only create dependence, that the gift of knowledge was incomplete without the space to use it independently. Perhaps the silence is confidence. Perhaps they watch from their distant abodes, satisfied that the preparations were adequate. Or perhaps they trusted us. Perhaps they saw in the students they had taught something that gave them hope. Perhaps the departure was not calculation but faith, not strategy but belief that what they had started would continue without them. Perhaps they loved what they had made, in whatever way beings of their nature experienced love, and left because love requires letting go. Or perhaps they had no choice. Perhaps the cycles they tracked permitted no alternative. Perhaps the event they anticipated required their absence from Earth for reasons the tablets do not explain. Perhaps they would have stayed if staying were possible, would have guided us through whatever is coming if guidance were permitted. Perhaps the silence is regret. We cannot know. The tablets do not say. The empty chambers offer no explanation. The millennia of absence provide no clarity. We have only the evidence of preparation, the proof that they expected us to need what they left, the inference that they anticipated difficulties we would face without them. The gift of knowledge was the gift of independence. Whatever they foresaw, whatever made them decide to leave, they did not leave us helpless. They left us equipped. They left us with everything they thought we would need. And then they left us to use it. What happens next was always going to be ours to face. Perhaps that is what they knew. Perhaps the cosmic cycles they tracked made clear that certain events could not be managed, that certain thresholds had to be crossed alone, that whatever was coming would test whether the students had learned what the teachers had taught. Perhaps they left because leaving was the final lesson, the demonstration that we could survive their absence, the proof that the chain of transmission they had established would hold. The stars they taught us to read still turn above the ruins of Uruk. The constellations they named still wheel through the sky in patterns that repeat on timescales exceeding human lifespans. The cycles they calculated still complete themselves according to mathematics that does not care whether anyone is watching. Above the museum archives where tablets breathe in darkness, above the excavation sites where foundations still hold their buried messages, above the reconstructed ziggurats where tourists climb without understanding, the same stars burn that the Anunnaki watched when they walked among us. Whatever they foresaw, whatever they prepared for, whatever made them decide that 4,000 years ago was the moment to depart and not return, we are living in the aftermath. We are living in the silence they left behind. We are living in the space they created for us to become whatever we will become. The tablets wait in their archives. The fingerprints reach across time. The beds remain made for visitors who have not come in 40 centuries. And the mystery persists, patient as the clay that carries it, waiting for whoever finally learns to hear what the absence has been saying all along. The wind moves through the ruins, the stars turn, the silence continues. And somewhere in that silence, in the space between what was written and what remains to be understood, the answer waits. Not an answer that resolves, an answer that deepens, an answer that opens into further questions, into cycles not yet completed, into futures not yet arrived. They knew what was coming. They prepared us as best they could, and then they left. What we do with what they gave us is no longer their story. It is ours.